It's a new day, but not on Deep Space Nine. Jake's in a mega shuttle with Bashir, the latter boring the former to tears. Jake asked some publication or other if he could write a profile of Bashir, presumably thinking the credit for an actual article would sound professional. Unfortunately, now he has to actually do it, when what he really wants is something more interesting. The universe must be listening. We're getting a distress call from a Federation colony. It would seem some Klingons don't consider the recent hostilities quite as over as the rest of us and have launched an invasion. All of which wouldn't be the problem of two schmucks in a megashuttle, except a hospital's been hit and they specifically need medical assistance. Bashir's not entirely sure about taking the son of his commanding officer into a war zone, but Jake manages to convince him it's his duty. If Jake just happens to get a better story along the way, then all the better. Sisko's not delighted by the news, but there's a Starfleet ship on the way to offer relief and will be there in a couple of days, which is one better than we could do in the Defiant. Bashir will evacuate with Jake when they arrive. Until then, we're going to be busy. We land a little away from the caves the colonists are using for a makeshift hospital and hoof it there to find semi-organized chaos. Bashir gets to work while Jake gets in the way. That's largely because he's taken aback by the reality. So too was the newest patient with a foot wound. He says it was caused by a Klingon weapon, but Bashir thinks it looks distinctly Federation in origin and leaves him to treat others in greater need. The man's protestations mix with his experiences on the front line and, finally, an admission that he wounded himself to get away from it all. Jake tries to block it all out and focus on how he'll start his article. The universe isn't done with him yet, though, and he's pressed into helping with the wounded instead, the staff here having no time for uninjured observers. He's covered in claret by the first guy he's told to watch, but as he didn't run screaming afterwards, he passed the test. The promotion comes with a uniform, which also becomes distinctly more red as his day being a porter continues. It ends only when they run out of patience, and he has a well-deserved rest with Bashir and the other medics. Probably just as well that he's getting used to the work, as back on DS9 we've had some news. The ship that was going to bring relief has been intercepted and destroyed. Sisko heads off with Dax in the Defiant, meaning Jake has another 3 days of his new job before rescue will arrive. We're in a canteen of some sort, one that's curiously well furnished for a cave, given that we were told the hospital was destroyed, and Bashir and Jake are having something to eat. Well, they're going to until the day's actions catch up with Jake, and Bashir guides him outside to empty his stomach. They return when he's sufficiently purged, and on the way, talk about the guy who pooped yellow at his own foot. Jake's confused as to how it could happen. He's Starfleet, and they're both trained and tested. Reality, says Bashir, is a test all its own, and one with no guarantee of passing. Bashir leaves Jake to have another go at food while he checks on a patient. It's also a chance to talk to one of the doctors there and catch her up on wider news. It's all about fighting Klingons, a battle group on the way to the system Gowron, boss lad of the Klingons, was talking about at the end of the last season. Good news that we're trying to retake it, but bad news that one of the ships leading the task force has the Doctor's husband working on it. The bad news keeps on coming as Jake's new mate has heard the ship dispatched to help us here has been kaboomed. Quite how he heard when the previous scene said the Klingons have been blocking everything is unknown, but let's ignore that for now. He's also heard the Klingons will have overrun this place in a couple of days. That, coupled with them having no concept of a non-combatant, is potentially very bad news for us. Still, it's not stopped most of them from getting some sleep later, even if Jake himself is struggling to join them. On the plus side, that means he's awake when the Klingons kaboom their reactor. The lights have backup power at least, but the medical equipment doesn't, and that's bad news for their patients. It's also going to be a few hours until things are back online, according to the head doctor, and all other portable power is currently in use keeping shields up for the settlement, so it's lucky Bashir remembers the mega shuttle we arrived on has a portable generator as well. He says he needs help carrying it, so Jake goes with him, which means both of them are caught outside when the shelling starts. Fortunately, whoever's in charge of making the shells forgot to put explosives in, so it's not particularly dangerous if you don't take a direct hit, which is what Bashir does. Jake sees him go down, and having a healthy sense of self-preservation, he runs the fuck away. Jake's course takes him through the middle of a battlefield, though thankfully one that's not currently active. There's at least one guy still moving, though, and he bops Jake on the noggin for falling into his crater. To be fair, that's understandable. He's all kinds of bollocksed up and assumed a Klingon was coming back to finish the job. Not that there's much need for it, as the guy thinks he doesn't have long left. Jake seizes on the chance for redemption. He might have scarpered from Bashir, but if he can get this lad back to the makeshift hospital, it'll even out. The guy isn't convinced when Jake explains it to him, but the whole thing becomes academic when he carks it. Away Jake legs it, maybe to find another victim to save. Perhaps he could start with the patient who's been put on the edge of a fucking cliff back at the cave hospital, as that's where he ends up. His new mate is pleased to see him, and Jake's relieved to learn Bashir made it back. He's injured, but he also managed to get the generator, so the power's back on. Jake tries to decline visiting Bashir and fails, though it would seem he's unaware of Jake's hasty withdrawal and is just happy he's alive. That makes the guilt worse, of course, and Jake considers himself a coward who can't be counted on. It makes him more sympathetic to the guy who injured himself to get off the front line at least, though that lad's already decided he should leave Starfleet because he doesn't deserve the uniform. That's not exactly the reassurance Jake needed, and his anger flares at the others when they start making morbid jokes about the likelihood of Klingons attacking them here. Bashir tries to talk to him, but Jake's not ready for it and just tells him to bugger off. He manages to fall asleep after the inevitable tears at least, though being woken by kabooms probably isn't the best thing for him. The Klingons have arrived at our settlement, and that means we're getting the hell out of here. We're taking the patients and whatever shit we need out of the caves and, assuming the transport we board isn't shot down, evacuating elsewhere. Jake's one of the last out, largely because he stuck himself under a table when bits of the roof started falling. He moves when he realizes staying here would be the more dangerous option, which is unfortunate timing, as that's when the Klingons turn up and kill the 2 guards we were given for the evacuation. Jake's panic leads to him grabbing one of the guards' weapons and wildly pooping yellow at random, the result of which brings down the ceiling. This solves the Klingon problem, but also knocks out Jake. He wakes to Bashir telling him his dad's here and everything's all right. The ceasefire is now back in effect, so the fighting's over, presumably until they decide it isn't again. More than that, Jake's impromptu rockfall sealed the entrance the Klingons were using and meant everybody else was able to scarper with their patience. Jake is a hero. Jake is not a hero. He's written the article on his experiences and has been brutally honest about the whole thing. His constant fear, abandoning Bashir, the heroic act being nothing more than desperate firing at random. Sisko's read his advance copy of the article and found it to be a highly accurate portrayal of combat, one that he thinks will be very familiar to anybody who's had personal experience. So we'll leave Jake to contemplate what this means, not only for himself, but also those people he considers heroes, until the next adventure. If there's one thing old Trek regularly struggles to show, it's the reality of conflict. That's not an insult of the series themselves, but rather a reflection of the limitations placed on them. These were, after all, primarily a product, and ones from a time before video on demand and a proliferation of personal screens allowed everybody to watch whatever they pleased. That means appealing to as wide an audience as possible, and you alienate the fewest viewers by making it family-friendly. Part of that involves grinding off all the sharp edges, which is why we've seen so many fights with blades be coupled with little to no bodily fluids. The sanitized versions of such fights have a downside, though. By removing the biological results of combat, we present a version that downplays the negatives, something that more closely resembles a comic book than serious drama. A display where the consequences are not evident is a display with inherent bias. There's perhaps even an argument to be made that such efforts risk glorifying battle, displays of clean violence which ignore the realities in ways that border on propaganda. We're shown heroes who sacrifice everything for the uniform, rather than people who die screaming in pain. This story, then, is an attempt to move away from the tendency to show war through sterile goggles. No defiant laughs and bravery here, only blood and fear and death, all viewed through the eyes of somebody experiencing it close up for the first time. I've said before that I often think characters are made more real when they're humbled. If you've been watching these for a while, you'll know that I think The Quickening is one of the episodes that best defines who Julian Bashir is. Masks tend to slip when people fail. So too then for Jake here. It's easy to imagine oneself brave and noble when in comparative safety or under the protection of those you trust. We all consider ourselves the protagonists to one degree or another, something Jake would be all the more familiar with because of his writing. When the plot of his own story doesn't go the way he'd planned, the result is understandable. His failure is not the defining moment of the episode, though. The article is. A man who lives and breathes fiction, refusing to lean on it to cover his own shortcomings, is a powerful indicator of his values. As morals go, it's a pretty good one. We are not defined by our errors so much as how we react to them. That's not to say the episode was flawless, though. There were a couple of bits that felt, well, clumsy is too harsh a term perhaps, but rather unpolished. The first is that we're given 3 different reasons why teleporters aren't an option by the end of the story, and one would have been fine. As we're approaching the planet, we're told mineral composition of the caves prevents teleporting. Once we're there, we're told there are Klingon countermeasures. As we're fetching the portable power, shields are the reason. It's almost as if parts of this were written in isolation and nobody thought to check if there were already excuses in place. The result is sections of dialogue that feel redundant. There's a similar issue with fetching the generator. Bashir originally says he needs help in retrieving it, then we discover he managed it on his own. Memory Alpha suggests this could be considered a bit of foreshadowing about Bashir, and I'd love to be similarly generous, but that seems contrary to another line in the episode. Whatever happens, one of us has to get that generator, the implication being that Jake could manage it on his own as well. It's a problem that could have been fixed by swapping out him needing help with him saying he could use help, replacing a definite with a variable. Again, it's a small thing, but one that feels like it could have been fixed with a final pass of editing. They're both relatively minor complaints, though, in a strong showing for perhaps Deep Space Nine's most underused character. Jake's always had the potential to show us what it's like to grow up in the Starfleet life without having personally chosen to be part of it, and this is probably the closest we've come to achieving that. There's a strong argument to be made that he does more growing in this single episode than he has during the previous 4 seasons. Well, as long as you ignore time fuckery anyway. End of episode.
What's a GeoCities?
I don't know, but apparently your online credibility is linked to how many animated GIFs you have there.
GIFs.
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 No, bugger it, I don't care. So this GeoCities is where the internet lives, is it?
Apparently so, and they have phone lines provided by a company called ICQ.
Alright then, sounds like a plan. How do we get there?
Most people move around by using something called search engines. I've selected InfoSeek and AltaVista to start with.
Any others?
Well, the guy who writes these skits was going to include Hotbot, but it looks like whoever owns the shell of that company has pivoted into AI bullshit, so fuck 'em.
Hold on, I thought you were AI.
It's not the same.
How so?
Because, unlike the current fad, I'm honest about the fact that my responses are littered with errors. Woof.